It was 3:17 a.m. when the monitors in the pediatric ward began to malfunction. The nurses on duty that night would later say they felt it before they saw it. A cold, creeping dread that slithered down their spines like ice water. But what happened next would leave one nurse permanently scarred both physically and mentally. The story: the pediatric ward of St. Vincent's Hospital was usually a place of hope, filled with the laughter of children and the soft hum of medical equipment. But on this particular night, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Nurse Emily Carter had been working the night shift for years, but something felt off. The air was too still, the fluorescent lights too dim, and the usual sounds of the hospital seemed muffled, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Around 3:00 a.m., Emily was making her rounds when she noticed something strange. The heart monitor in room 214, where a 7-year-old boy named Tommy was recovering from surgery, began to flicker. The steady beep of his heartbeat faltered, then stopped entirely. Emily rushed into the room only to find Tommy sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Confused, she checked the monitor, which now displayed a flat line. She unplugged it and plugged it back in, but the machine remained silent. Before she could call for help, the lights in the room dimmed and the temperature dropped sharply. Emily's breath came out in visible puffs, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She turned around, but the room was empty, except for a dark shadow in the corner near the window. It was tall, too tall, and seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow began to move toward Tommy's bed, its form elongating and twisting unnaturally. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She reached for the emergency call button, but her hand passed through it as if it weren't there. The shadow loomed over Tommy, and for a moment Emily thought it was going to engulf him. But then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The lights returned to normal, and the heart monitor began beeping again. Shaken, Emily called for backup, but no one believed her story. The doctors chalked it up to stress and fatigue. But Emily knew what she had seen. Over the next few weeks, she began to notice strange things happening around her. Objects would move on their own, whispers echoed in empty hallways, and she would catch glimpses of the shadow out of the corner of her eye. It was always there, watching, waiting. One night, Emily was alone in the break room when the lights flickered. She turned around, and there it was, the shadow closer than ever before. This time, it reached out for her. She felt an icy grip on her wrist, and a searing pain shot through her arm. When she looked down, her skin was blackened and blistered, as if burned by something impossibly cold. Emily quit her job the next day, but the shadow followed her home. She still sees it sometimes, lurking in the corners of her apartment, a constant reminder of that night in room 214. And every time she closes her eyes, she hears the sound of Tommy's heart monitor flat-lining. Years later, Emily learned that room 214 had a dark history. Decades before, a young boy had died there under mysterious circumstances. His death was ruled an accident, but rumors persisted that he had been neglected by the staff. Some say his spirit never left the hospital, and that the shadow Emily encountered was something far worse. A malevolent force drawn to the suffering of the innocent. The morgue at Cedar Ridge Hospital was always cold, but on this particular night it felt like the temperature had dropped below freezing. The mortician, a seasoned professional named Harold, had seen countless bodies in his career, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found, or rather what found him on that fateful evening. Harold had been working late, preparing a body for an early morning autopsy. The deceased was a middle-aged woman who had died of a sudden heart attack. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. He tried to focus on his task, but the unease grew with every passing minute. It started with a whisper. At first, Harold thought it was his imagination, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the far corner of the morgue, where the older refrigeration units were kept. The whispers were faint, almost melodic, but the words were impossible to understand. Harold's hands trembled as he set down his tools and approached the source of the sound. The whispers led him to Unit 12, a refrigeration unit that hadn't been used in years. The door was slightly ajar and a faint bluish light spilled out from within. Harold hesitated, then pulled the door open. Inside, he found the body of a young woman, her skin pale and her eyes wide open. She looked as if she had just been placed there, but Harold knew that was impossible. Unit 12 had been empty for decades. Before he could react, the woman's head turned toward him, and her lips began to move. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and Harold realized with horror that they were coming from her. He stumbled backward, but the woman's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, and her skin was freezing cold. Harold tried to pull away, but the whispers filled his mind, drowning out all other thoughts. The next thing he knew, Harold was lying on the floor of the morgue. The door to Unit 12 closed and locked. He had no memory of how he got there, but his wrist was bruised and frostbitten. The whispers were gone, but he could still feel their presence, lingering in the back of his mind like a dark secret. Over the next few weeks, Harold began to experience strange lapses in memory. He would wake up in the morgue with no recollection of how he got there, his hands stained with blood that wasn't his. The whispers returned every night, growing louder and more insistent. They were no longer just whispers. They were commands, urging him to do unspeakable things. One night, Harold gave in. He followed the whispers to Unit 12 and opened the door. Inside, he found the young woman's body, just as he had seen it before. But this time she was surrounded by other bodies, patients who had died in the hospital under mysterious circumstances. The whispers told him what to do, and Harold obeyed, his hands moving of their own accord. When the police found him the next morning, Harold was sitting in the corner of the morgue, surrounded by the mutilated remains of the bodies. He was muttering to himself, his eyes vacant and his skin pale. He was never the same after that night, and the whispers never left him. The hospital closed the morgue shortly after the incident, but the whispers are said to still linger in the halls of Cedar Ridge. Some say they are the voices of the dead, trapped between worlds and seeking revenge. Others believe they are something far more sinister, a force that preys on the living, using them to carry out its dark desires. The fourth floor of Mercy General Hospital was known for its long, winding hallways, but no one could explain why one particular hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Nurses who worked the night shift avoided it at all costs, claiming that it was haunted by something that didn't want to be found. But when a new intern named Sarah decided to investigate, she discovered that some doors are better left unopened. Sarah had always been curious, and the stories about the fourth floor hallway only fueled her fascination. The other staff members warned her to stay away, but she couldn't resist. One night, after her shift ended, she decided to explore the infamous hallway. The moment she stepped into the hallway, she knew something was wrong. The air was thick and heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Sarah pressed on, determined to reach the end of the hallway, but no matter how far she walked, it never seemed to end. The doors on either side were all identical, with no numbers or labels to distinguish them. After what felt like hours, Sarah finally reached a door that was different from the others. It was old and weathered, with a tarnished brass handle. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside, she found a small, dimly lit room filled with medical equipment that looked decades out of date. In the center of the room was a hospital bed, and lying on it was a woman in a tattered hospital gown. The woman's eyes were closed, and her skin was pale and waxy. Sarah approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, she realized that the woman wasn't breathing. She reached out to check for a pulse, but the moment her fingers touched the woman's wrist, the woman's eyes snapped open. Sarah stumbled backward, but the woman sat up and grabbed her arm. Her grip was cold and unyielding, and her eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, Sarah heard a voice in her head, low and guttural, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah tried to pull away, but the woman's grip tightened. The room began to spin, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the woman's voice echoing in her mind as everything went black. When Sarah woke up, she was lying on the floor of the hallway, the door to the room nowhere in sight. She had no memory of how she got there, but her arm was bruised and swollen as if it had been gripped by something with inhuman strength. Over the next few weeks, Sarah began to experience strange symptoms. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her body freezing cold and her mind filled with visions of the woman in the hospital gown. The voice in her head grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. One night, Sarah returned to the 4th floor, drawn by an irresistible force. She walked the endless hallway until she found the door again. This time she didn't hesitate. She opened the door and stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. Sarah was never seen again. The hospital sealed off the 4th floor, but the hallway is said to still exist, waiting for its next victim. Some say the woman in the hospital gown was a patient who died under mysterious circumstances, her spirit trapped in the hospital for eternity. Others believe she was something far more sinister, a guardian of the hallway, ensuring that no one who enters ever leaves.